For the first time in decades, China did not announce a GDP growth target in its annual government work report. What's the significance and what else can this year's key political meetings tell us about the global economy post-virus? And a draft decision on a national security bill for Hong Kong was submitted to China's national legislature for deliberation. Why now, and what does it mean for the one country, two systems principle? Welcome to The Point, an opinion show coming to you live from Beijing. I'm Lifen. China's annual meeting of the National People's Congress kicked off on Friday after a delay of over 2 months caused by COVID-19. In the open meeting of the third session of the 13th MPC, Chinese Premier Li Keqiang delivered this year's government work report, announcing stimulus plans to revive the disrupted economy, among many other issues. This year, however, the report did not include a target for GDP growth. What's significant about this rare decision, and against the backdrop of the global pandemic, what's been announced to steer through the economic uncertainty ahead? I'm pleased to be joined by Professor Zhang Weiwei, Director of the China Institute of Fudan University from Shanghai, and Professor Zhang Lifen from the School of Journalism at Fudan University, also the founding editor of ftchinese.com. He's joining us from the United States. So, gentlemen, welcome to The Point. I want to talk about this rare decision of omitting a GDP growth target in this year's government work report. He, however, said that China's GDP growth for last year was 6.1%, not too bad at all, but there is no number for this year. The Premier said the decision of dropping a specific number was made because the country will face some factors that are difficult to predict in its development due to the great uncertainty regarding the pandemic and the world economic and trade environment. Professor Zhang Weiwei, how do you look at this rare decision that no target was set for this year's economic growth? What are the possible considerations behind the move?
Well, I think indeed, as Premier Li mentioned in his report, this highly uncertain situation caused by the pandemic, especially at this moment outside China. And if you look at the, say, United States as an example, now President Donald Trump is asking for a strong push for this returning to work. Yet his experts, specialists, scientists advise him perhaps not to do so. That could lead to second outbreak. And in China, we have also experts who think, that could cause more problems than it's now. And also, given the economic stimulus in the United States, we think it may eventually lead to financial crisis, indeed. So there are a lot of unpredictable possibilities. So I think it's sensible at this stage that China will not give a very specific growth target. And we can wait for a while, maybe 3 or 4 months into this year, and we will see a better picture.
Lifen, how do you look at this phenomenon, let's say? I mean, I know you have followed these two sessions for almost a decade, and on record, this is the first time since 1994 that China hasn't set a target. Is it a small decision to make for China?
I think it is a strategic shift from what the government has been doing, normally setting a very specific target, now to no target at all. I think it shows some maturity on the government side, basically concluding the double-digit growth that China has been enjoying in the past 3 decades is now truly over. I think China has to move to a more realistic assessment in terms of managing its economy. I don't think the target itself is only a target, but also it's a mindset issue, it's a psychology issue. I think China has been struggling with maintaining certain targets for so long, but now I hope the removal of a particular target can also remove some of the psychological barriers for policymakers. They now have a more wiggle room to play with in terms of planning the economy for the years to come.
It is indeed very interesting in the psychological perspective. Weiwei, I don't know whether you have anything to say on that front, but also it's also a.
In fact,
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, actually, it's already evolving in that direction in many ways since quite a few years ago, especially after Xi Jinping came to power. You can see increasingly we move towards what we call a range of targets and objectives. If you look at targets per se, now there are two types. One is you may call binding targets. For instance, for CO2 emissions in China, now there is a binding target. But there are also what's called the expected targets, which are not that much binding, which means the government will try to create a favorable environment, favorable conditions in which the economy and market force will play it out. Actually, this GDP growth rate is in this kind of category, expected objective, expected targets.
Yeah. However,
so we are moving towards the quality of the economy,
right?
Especially
right.
at this stage, it's even more important.
Well, the Chinese government and the Chinese society may have some time already to adapt to this kind of a psychological change, and yet for the larger world, I want to go to Lifen, observing from your perspective. Should the world be slightly worried or even concerned? Because the first quarter, China's GDP was down by 6.8%, an unprecedented figure for the past few decades, and now there's no clear target set. In an interconnected world economy, should other economies be asking some questions or scratching their heads at this moment? Lifen.
Well, I think the situation at the moment, especially... Okay, thank you. I think the situation at the moment, especially in the aftermath of the pandemic, ongoing pandemic, I think the situation is worrying. But as regard to the situation with the Chinese economy, I think the world has already accepted the fact that China is slowing down, and slowing down very, very quickly. Considering 6.1 last year, together with a couple of years ago, double digits, is already half of the size of the growth. So I think there's no secret. China is moving slow, and also the world has to accept that China is slowing down. So I think it's so important that China and the rest of the world recognize the factor. It's no longer the case of double-digit growth. I think every year when I come back to the United States in the winter time, I'll always do the checking at a superstore to checking the visibility of the Chinese products. I have to say that in the past 3 or 4 years, the visibility of the Chinese products in the American superstore, the supermarket, it's just getting less and less. That's the reality. I think in the past few weeks that there's more talking about the decoupling between the United States and China. So we now really have to move into a new reality. I think that's the issue that we have to confront together as a world.
Yeah, that's a very interesting perspective. Weiwei, how do you look at the lack of a specific GDP growth target, not just in a quantitative dimension, but also on the psychological side, and against the backdrop of several years of trade wars between China and the United States, and the increasing call for decoupling between the two sides?
Well, I think it does not make much sense for the United States to do so. If it chose to do so, we cannot help. I think it will isolate itself more so. The United States needs China's help more than any time in its history. So at this moment, it's not time to fight a trade war. It should cut tariffs to zero. Encourage China exports to the United States. Otherwise, you cannot cope with this pandemic. That's my personal view. And secondly, I think China economy is already very large, even in terms of U.S. dollar-based economy. But if we calculate in purchasing power parity, it's already very big. So even a modest growth rate, if you look at the say last year size of China economy, I made a rough calculation. So every 2 years or 2.5 years, China can produce one United Kingdom in terms of GDP. Yeah, so it's already big. Of course, now with this pandemic, especially the unfavorable external environment, it will cause more problems. Indeed, that's true. But on the other hand, everything really exists in comparison. After all, China is the only major economy that has moved out of the pandemic. We are now hosting this People's Congress, over 3,000 delegates, present at this great hall of people, which only China can do now. China, and you look at the figure for this May festival, 4-day holiday, Chinese tourism again reached the 40% of the same period of last year. Mm-hmm. But 40% is significant because only 30% of the capacity has been opened this time. So right. Already 40% of last year. So it's a signal we have tremendous potential.
Mr. Zhang Lifen, I want to get your assessment of the kind of potential or the state of the fundamentals of the Chinese economy. Yes, indeed, there are many difficulties. China suffered a big loss because of the fight against pandemic at the beginning of this year. And yet, when we look at the stimulus packages that are being put in place, when we look at the domestic demand that could be generated, how do you look at the longer-term prospects? Let's say at the end of this year, what will China's economy be looking like?
I think 2020 is a very different year. I think in 100 years' time, historians will be having a very definitive view how important this year will be or has been. I think in terms of the stimulus package, we have been there in 2008 in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, but this time is so different. I think this time difference in terms of two important ways. One is that the state of the trade and the economy or the interaction between the United States and China is very troublesome at the moment. There's a lot of question which has been asked about the handling of the Trump administration, but also I think this particular Congress, the two sessions which are currently on hold in Beijing, should also ask some of the fundamental questions in terms of the future directions of the Chinese economy, in terms of the future management of the economy, in terms of, as Professor Weiwei has just mentioned about the stimulus package and also boosting the domestic demand. We have been hearing and talking this for years, but as yet, I think there's no clear sign the domestic demand of the Chinese economy or the consumption has been generated. So why this is an issue? So if there's a stimulus package, I think it is so important for the money to be directed to areas which really will be helpful in generating the consumer demands and also will really helping the restructuring of the economy.
Right. Well, this year, during the deliverance of the government work report, multiple rounds of applause were heard, especially when government were talking about how small, medium-sized enterprises are to be helped, and how, for instance, migrant workers or how people are able to increase their salary so that they can turn that into consuming power. Weiwei, first to you, and then Lifen, I want to wrap up with you. Have you seen some signs that the stimulus packages that we're seeing are different from the ones from 2008, 2009, and could be on the right track of stimulating domestic demand?
Well, I think it's working in the sense that if you look at the economic recovery rate, it's gaining momentum. And then if you look at for instance, one major item mentioned in Premier Li's work report is creating jobs, 9 million something. Right. And then all kinds of, for instance, you have in Shanghai, in Guangzhou, the local governments provide subsidies to enterprises which recruit college graduates. They also provide subsidies directly to students to create their own whatever, startups. So these are working. And furthermore, what's more important is most Chinese, unlike Americans, they have savings. Yeah. Okay. And don't worry, it will come.
Okay, we will really have to wrap it up. But Lifen, 10 seconds, if you will. Lifen.
Honestly, I think Professor Weiwei has been too complacent about the situation. I think there's a lot of fundamental issues which is too early to clarify. I don't really think that it is time for China or the Chinese policymakers or scholars to have such a high feeling or good feeling about it. I think that time has already passed.
Okay, we'll wait and see whether confidence is well qualified. We'll wait and see. Many thanks to Professor Zhang Weiwei and Professor Zhang Lifen joining us. And we'll take a short break, and when we come back, China's national legislature is deliberating a proposed national security law for Hong Kong. Why now, and what might it mean for the one country, two systems principle? Stay with us.